All right, good morning everybody. My name is Steve Kopitz. I'm the managing director of Princeton Energy Advisors, which is my own company. Up until recently I worked for Douglas Westwood, which is an oil and gas consultancy. We did market research and commercial due diligence for oil field services and technology companies, for private equity funds, and supporting initial public offerings on the stock exchanges around the world. So I've spent a lot of my time down in the weeds looking at things like seventh generation drill ships, floating production semi-submersibles, and then all the way down to things like fracking techniques and pressure pumping and gypsum and valves and pumps and compressors. I probably know more about multi-phase twin screw compressors than I'd really care to, and that's probably why I left Douglas Westwood. So what I had done at Douglas Westwood was I did most of the macro work for the firm. I enjoy macro work, and that's what I do today. I'm currently writing a book on supply-constrained markets forecasting. It'll be published by Springer, which is down in Greenwich Village, and it's being funded by a hedge fund. So that's what I do. I'm an industry consultant, and I'm a technical guy. So here's my cover. You can see one of the things, if you do a lot of presentations and you do pictures, after a while you become really good at propaganda. So, you know, it's one of those things, oh, I need a New York picture for my presentation. I always do. I did one in Sicily last August, and you know, I had all kinds of interesting Sicilian pictures there. Now this is a New York picture. So we got a green light, we got a one-way, and the end is near. We have all these sorts of themes running through this presentation as well. Alrighty. So we're going to talk a little bit, this is really a little more technical discussion about the oil supply outlook, what it means for the economy, and sort of how we got here. Yeah, I've already told you a little bit about me. Now let me tell you a little about what we're going to talk about. So we will talk about how we got here in terms of oil issues and questions, what's going on in the industry today, what will happen, and what can we do about it, okay? So how we got here, okay. So historically, oil demand has gone up as a function of GDP. So if you took the GDP growth and you multiplied that by about 3/4, that's about how much the oil demand would grow, okay, in an average year. So if GDP growth was 4% globally, we'd expect the oil supply to grow at 3% globally. And that was more or less true up until late 2004, mid-2005. And there are two things that happened at that time. One of them was that China became a much more dominant force on the demand side, and that the oil supply effectively stalled out. This was the sort of Matt Simmons period of peak oil, and you know, terrible things would happen, and actually a good many of those terrible things have happened. But as a practical matter, after 2005, oil demand continued to grow much faster than supply, and that's true to the present day, and that's why oil's expensive. Okay. So, talking a little bit about China. China is the driver of demand in our models and the way we think about them, right? We have the oil supply, which is the anvil. We have China, which is the hammer, and we have the US, which is getting pounded in between. So how much demand should China have? You know, China has 4.3 times the US population, and it should develop somewhat like Korea or Japan did at similar periods in their development. And we can look at China as Japan in 1960, or we can look at China as Korea in 1976 to 1996. And if we apply this model, what we see is a couple of different things. So one is that China's ultimate demand, where demand sort of steadies out at a steady state, doesn't grow too fast after that, we would expect China to plateau somewhere between 35 and 45 million barrels per day. For purposes of comparison, China is at 11 million barrels per day, and the US is at 18.5. So if you do the math, China should plateau out somewhere around 2.5 times US consumption, okay? It won't consume as much per capita, but there are more per capitas to consume it. When does that happen? The S curve, so when you go in a society develops, it doesn't consume a lot of oil, and as it becomes middle class, it consumes a lot of oil very fast, and then once it's reached that peak, it doesn't consume that much more per capita, okay? So that S curve is roughly 20 to 30 years. So it's about one generation. So from the time the first guy on the block gets his car to the last guy on the block gets his car is about 20 years. It's about a generation. Okay, so it's pretty quick. It's not a 70-year, not a 100-year process. It's pretty fast. China got onto that S-curve right around 2003. So it would get off that S-curve right around 2030, plus or minus. If you like, I'm happy to post this thing for you so you can do this. I have a longer version of this presentation I did at Columbia University back in February. It's not as up to date, but it's essentially the same topics. So, so what we're talking about is right now China would like to add about 2 US equivalents of consumption between now and 2030, 2035. Okay, that's a whole whopping amount of oil that you want to put into play. And if you look at China's role in the global economy, it's represented about half of global growth over the last 10 years or so. So if we said China wants another 30 million barrels, you could allocate another 30 million barrels per day to places like India, Africa, and all these countries we affectionately refer to as the other non-OECD, which are not interesting enough to hit anybody's radar, but in fact are about 2 billion people around the globe. So we have a whole lot on paper. It is not hard to make the case for another 60 million barrels of demand on 90 million barrels of production today. So that's an increase of 2/3 in the next 20 years, plus or minus, okay? Now, the question is, of course, do we have that kind of oil? And in fact, we have estimates of 2030 oil supply, keeping in mind that probably nobody can make forecasts much more than 5 years, but that doesn't stop us from doing so. And we have estimates from the major agencies, the major oil companies. If we take a look at the top range of this estimates for 2030, these come from Exxon, BP, and the US Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, the EIA. The EIA is going to be the primary source of numbers here, so these are the numbers that I'm showing you are principally US government numbers. Okay, so they're at 103 to 107 million barrels per day in 2030 versus 90 today. Total, the French company, and the OECD's, the International Energy Agency, which is not the EIA, but rather the IEA, and of course is French. Those Total, which is also French, those guys see the oil supply peaking out at 95 to 96 million barrels per day. And then the ASPO, the peak oil guys, this is Shell Aliklet, the rather grumpy but highly intelligent Shell Aliklet from Uppsala University in Sweden. He said 75 million barrels for 2030, excluding shales. But you can slice them and dice them. These are all peak oil forecasts, right? Whether we talk about BP or Exxon or EIA or IEA, you know, none of them show the kind of accommodation that would be necessary to accommodate, you know, a country as large as China modernizing as quickly as it is. Okay, so we're short. We've been short on oil since 2003, really materially since 2005. And this kind of pressure is likely to sustain through 2030, and if India gets its act together, could sustain through 2050. All right. So if we have a situation where there's not enough oil to go around, right? So what happens then, right? So you can imagine that I'd stopped at Dunkin' Donuts. I actually did stop at Dunkin' Donuts. You can delete that from the film. But if we had a donut here for everybody and we had a box of donuts, right? And then if more people came into the room, then everybody would start getting less than 1 donut per head, right? You have to share. And that's exactly what's happening now as China's coming into the market, right? China's putting pressure and bidding away the oil consumption of the advanced economies. So there's nothing particularly strange or obscure about that. That's a very natural process, okay? And if we forecast out to 2030 and say that there would be 100 million barrels of supply at that time, let's pick a number, then we can actually forecast what US consumption is likely to be at that level, at that time, and that comes out about 14 million barrels a day versus 18.5 today. Okay, so you keep going down percent and a half. Gets a little more complicated, but that's the simple story. Okay, so the story is demand's more than supply. If demand is more than supply, then the fast-growing countries are going to bid away part of the consumption of the slow-growing countries, and that's exactly what the data shows. On this slide here, so we can see since 2007, so December 2007, the start of the Great Recession, OECD consumers, that's advanced country consumers, are providing half of all the incremental oil consumption of the emerging markets. Okay, so the principal place where China drills for oil is on Main Street, USA. Okay, that's their single biggest source of supply for incremental oil consumption in China. This has declined a little bit. These transfers of consumption tend to happen traumatically and dramatically during recessions. So So that's principally when these transfers occur. They do also occur during periods of economic growth, but more slowly. So in the last year, for example, OECD consumers provided 28%, a little more than a quarter of all non-OECD oil consumption growth. So we continue to supply those. This came principally out of Europe and Japan this past year. I would add, if you take a look at the countries who had crises here, okay, they were all mature economies, okay, and all of them were donating oil to the emerging markets. So if you look at the low blue line, that was what was contributed by the OECD economies, and every country that had a crisis is on that blue line. So that's US, UK, Ireland, Iceland, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Hungary, France, Italy, Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, you name it, they're down there, okay? And none of the countries who received that oil had a financial crisis. And that's one of those things that economists nowadays still feel I've presented this a bunch of different times in different places, but you know, when you say, gee, isn't it curious that the correlation between the donors of oil and the financial crises are almost overlap one for one. Yeah, that makes them uncomfortable, but nobody's happy about it, okay. So, so let's go on. So how do we adapt? So this is the US version of this thing that we saw up here, okay. Okay, so if you look down here, the US is the blue on the bottom, right? So that's the US consumption, the way we forecast this out. By the way, this is a pretty good forecast. I mean, you know, I'll tell you a story about ConocoPhillips once the thing turns off. I recommended they sell their refineries, and they did. Okay, so this is the US version, that lower line. And you can see here the top line in this is what we would have expected US oil consumption to be in the absence of price pressures related to China and a stalling oil supply, right? By rights, even with the recession, we should be consuming today about 22.5 million barrels. We had another oil shock here, by the way, in 2011 with the Arab Spring. With that, we should be at 20 million barrels, and where we are is 18.9. So we're 16% off of trend in US oil consumption today compared to what we would have expected to see, even allowing for the Great Recession. Okay. I would add here that the US has now consumed more oil here at the bottom. We're not sure why. One reason may be that oil producers get to consume more oil. That means that US shale oil production, which has been prodigious, may be one of the contributing factors that allow US oil consumption to sustain higher levels than Europe. If you take a look at European consumption, it's right on that dotted red line. So it's right to trend. It's the US which has deviated now since the third quarter of last year. All righty. Yeah, I'm not going to do this one. Vehicles miles traveled and GDP generally correlates. So what's happened here in this kind of peak oil type period? I don't like peak oil because it becomes very ideological, and I just do technical stuff. So my job is to get the calls right, not to characterize them. But you can see kind of how we adapt to these sorts of things. So you can see the first oil shock is the first little hump on the far left. The second oil shock is the second little hump in the middle, right? So what happens in a typical oil shock is we run out of spare capacity, the oil price goes up, we have a big shock, there's a recession, oil consumption falls, right? Resets to a lower level, and then starts to grow from there again. And GDP starts to grow with it from that point, okay? And that's a historical pattern. What we've seen in this last go-around is you can see that the peak driving, this is from DS Short. DS Short does great charts, and I always recommend them because I steal his charts left and right. But if you take a look, this is for non-institutional 16 and over population, you can see that the peak vehicle miles traveled was in June 2005. So our mobility peaked with the oil supply in 2005, and it has not recovered, and it continues to. It's more or less going sideways now, not down, but it's pretty flat. So it takes tremendous force to bend a vehicle miles traveled curve like that, right? Because that's people working or not working. It's a titanic force to bend that kind of a curve down. All right. Peak car ownership was in 2006, predates the recession. And then one of the things we hear often is that it's peak demand and not peak supply. The numbers really don't substantiate that at all, and I'm going to go through some of the arguments right here. One of them is that, old people don't want cars anymore. Well, that's not true. If you take a look, your probability of buying a car since the beginning of the Great Recession has gone very disproportionately to people older than 45. So those are the people buying more cars. This recession has been primarily a recession of ins and outs. If you were in and you retained your job, you're basically okay. If you were out, those are the people who paid the price of the recession. So it hasn't been a pro rata recession where everybody paid a similar price, right? And we're all under pressure. Some people are under a little pressure, guys like me who have jobs and pretty good incomes, and then those guys didn't have jobs are under a lot of pressure, right? So it's not that older people don't want cars. In fact, they're buying them more. And it's not that young people want to drive less. This is data from Michael Sivak and the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. And I always praise Michael as well. He's indispensable in these sorts of analyses. They do all kinds of interesting transportation-related stuff. And you can see here that they did a survey, and of the people without a job aged 18 to 39, okay, only 19% of persons aged 18 to 39 without a driver's license hold a full-time job. That's an amazingly bad statistic, right? So no driver's license, no job. That's almost a direct linkage. I mean, we live here in New York, you can work in New York without a car. But if you live in Baltimore and Austin, Texas, and Omaha, Nebraska, no car, no job, okay? And this chart on the right from the Highway Data Loss Institute suggests that unemployment represents 80% of the reason young people are driving less. So mobility and employment are closely linked, and that's a pretty obvious thing if you live anywhere in the suburbs, and most of the US is suburbs. All right. Yeah, no. Now, you would think, oh, well, all this is showing up primarily in cars. It's not. In fact, the least amount of adjustment in terms of oil consumption has come in automobiles. Almost all the adjustment has come elsewhere in oil consumption. And principally, one of those places is airlines. So if we take a look, we can see these are commercial airline departures. So like a Southwest or an American Airlines, right? And these have fallen 16% since 2005. So the amount of aircraft leaving LaGuardia is actually lower than it was in 2005, okay? And if we look at trend, it is 30% off trend, okay? So that means that at a JFK or a Philadelphia airport, literally one aircraft in 3 is not taking off compared to our ex-ante expectations, okay? That is a huge number. Now, the underlying numbers are not as bad. They're not as bad because the airlines have shifted to larger aircraft. Okay, so they have fewer departures, but more people because that's more fuel efficient. And the load factors have gone up. If any of you have flown recently, you know that it's become sort of a torture. And they put in these really thin seats so they've got like 12 more rows. And I don't know how they do it, but it's like if you're an expert in origami, you can probably fly Southwest nowadays. But otherwise, it's become more cramped. And the reason is that airlines, their cost of fuel has really gone up for them. I think it's 40% of their operating costs. And so what they're trying to do is cram the aircrafts, increasing load factors, increasing number of seats, increasing the size of the aircraft. So they're trying to compensate out. But there's only so much you can do with that, right? So that's more or less run its course, I think. So that's one really big area of compensation which we have done. Here's more. This is product supplied, so this is what comes out of the refineries and is supplied. If you take a look, what has grown a lot is ethane ethylene use. That comes from natural gas liquids. That's associated with fracking for natural gas principally. Okay? And that's up 72%. Why? Because we have a lot of cheap natural gas liquids. What has fallen? Diesel fuel is up a little bit. Gasoline is down a little bit. So interestingly, we can see a lot of compression vehicle miles traveled, but people are struggling to hold on to their mobility, to their cars. But they're giving up everything else. Jet fuel's down 14%, petcoke minus 25%, heating oil down 35%, distillate to power, residual fuel 64, 70%. The huge amount of adjustment of reducing our oil consumption is not coming out of driving. And there's a reason for that. In driving, oil remains a monopoly fuel. We don't have a choice. In terms of heating our home, we can heat it with natural gas if you like, or in my case, in our home we don't heat it anymore, we just wear a lot of sweaters. But you can adjust more in those types of areas. So in fact, if you take a look, transportation is what we struggle the most to preserve, right? And we've given up everything where we can substitute out.